All right. My opinion on the Devastation Mastery is something like this. It is not in any way something I would describe as overpowered. No chance. It's not something I would describe as, uh, you know, completely unbalanced, ridiculous, extremely good. It's none of those things. Now, I mean, let's flip that to the other side. Is it terrible? Is it absolutely the worst thing on the planet? Is is it existing cause for you to never get a raid spot ever under any circumstances on any fight? Full stop. Period. Even the the easy ones, even the hard ones. No, it's absolutely not that. So we've exhausted the two the two extremes. It's somewhere in the middle. Here's the thing with it, right? Mastery, Devastation Evoker's Mastery is a multiplier, and it says quite literally, "Hey, you do more damage at the start of a fight than the end of a fight on single target, right?" And then in AOE, you have some play around. So Mastery Giantkiller reads increases the damage of your spells based on the current health of your target. Higher health targets take more damage. So it's reverse execute. Um, you generally bloodlust on pull. You're generally dealing a ton of damage at the start of the fight. Oh, I promised I wanted to show something. So yeah, hold on. This is gonna detour completely what I was getting at, but let me just pull this up real quick. So I see a couple more people popped into the Discord. That's very exciting. Glad to see you guys. Good stuff. All right, so we're gonna pop this open here and do a window capture. All right, and then we'll make this bigger. So here's here are a couple graphs that Sale sent me. I just want to show kind of quickly because the point I think it was Zazars was making this point earlier, was saying, hey, I was looking at Evoker and I was thinking, man, this spec should be really bursty, right? Because you have this mastery and it makes you do a ton of damage sort of earlier in the fight and that kind of thing, and especially during your cooldown. And you have peaks with your cooldowns, right? Especially, so the first one's always with Bloodlust in a sim, unless you specify otherwise, and then, here are your cooldowns, right? But the thing is that what the mastery is really doing is not so much changing the difference. Can you see my mouse on the screen, by the way, on the stream? I thought you could, but oh, here we go. Okay. So it's not necessarily changing the difference between this peak and this so much, right? But it's affecting sort of just the general slope of your damage curve, where you're doing more damage here, you're doing less damage here. This is Shadow Priest, by the way, down here. So this is Devastation Evoker, and this is Shadow Priest. So Devastation Evoker is a 2-minute class. Shadow Priest is a 1-minute class, but with PI, has peaks at 2 minutes as well. And peak to trough, right? This is what you call burst. Because the difference between this window here and this window here is tremendous, right? The difference between this window here and this window here is tremendous. So, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but this is just to help illustrate. Burst comes from mainly, Dragonrage effectively being a strong cooldown or not. It's not necessarily going to be about, just this like passive multiplier that I have on my damage, where I'm dealing, X% more at the start of the fight than the end of the fight. So let me see. You can clearly see that the damage pattern is the same throughout, but goes down the longer it is, and the burst isn't that much higher. Yeah, exactly, right? So here's the thing, though. I do want to, I do want to kind of bring this back now to what we were talking about. Right now on beta, I have 79% mastery, and that's what I was playing with, right? So this is saying, hey, at the start of the fight, you're going to be dealing about 80% more damage than towards the end of the fight. Well, if Evoker is tuned exactly the same in line on average with every other class, regardless of kind of that first 20 seconds or so where, you know what, Evoker might fall behind a little bit because 80% more than baseline damage plus the small increase that Dragonrage is giving you is not enough to compete with the likes of Combustion or Shadow right now with like SFP, PI kind of stuff. But over that first minute, right, over that first sustained period, you're definitely going to see, you know, a pretty substantial damage because, again, we're looking sort of at the area under this curve here. We're looking at the area under this curve here for about this section. We're looking, I'm trying to get my mouse to show on the screen so I can point it out. We're looking at the area under the curve here versus the area under the curve here, right? And, you know, granted, okay, I mean, these things aren't comparable right now because this is way overtuned compared to this. But if these were in line, right, this would peak higher, but it would also trough lower. And that's sort of a notable thing. So you'll have burst is just the damage over like that first, you know, 30 seconds or so. Evoker's not quite bursty on pull. Hell, so yes, we're doing math. Not really, but, you know, this is sort of looking at Evoker Mastery in a sense, and this is Shadow's damage curve, where numbers are based on tuning, so not a big deal. But what's interesting about this damage curve, right, is that, yeah, it's pretty sustained, and you do only a little bit more with cooldowns, and cooldowns sort of have this very, you know, you're always touching the same point with your cooldowns because they assume full mastery value, right? So that's what full mastery value looks like. It's up here. Bloodlust was used, yeah. So Bloodlust would have been used on pull for both. Yeah, correct. What's interesting about Evoker Mastery, right, is, well, you know, you have this sloping pattern, but if you're tuned similarly to other classes, you either are in a situation where they decide, hey, we're going to make you do the same damage as other classes on average, in which case that might be a little undesirable, relatively speaking, because you might care a little bit more about execute. Or they might compensate and go, hey, we know that execute is generally more desirable. We might make Evoker do sort of top-end damage on average in order to somewhat compensate for the fact that it's not really doing execute damage. So, and a lot of that is just thinking about, you know, what does this part of the graph mean? But the biggest thing that I kind of want to point out is that there's a lot that goes on in fights, you know, in general, that isn't just how much damage are you doing in like the last 2 seconds of the fight kind of thing. Like, I kind of want to point out a couple of things, right? So one, a couple of the most recent end bosses that we've had have had no emphasis whatsoever on execute, right? So Jailer, I mean, okay, fine. Jailer, I'm going to get roasted for that one. It's not that it didn't have an emphasis on execute, but you were able to carry damage through the course of the fight, and damage that you dealt earlier in the fight mattered, right? So Devastation on a fight like that is actually dealing damage through what it does in phase 1, most notably, and it's able to, you know, if you're able to get sort of good damage amp from being in the melee soak, let's say, you can actually, you know, leverage those frequent buffs with the fact that you have the strong mastery, and you can actually do some damage. Yeah, and then, you know, Sylvanas obviously had no execute, right? But obviously that one a bit of an outlier, but more not necessarily to say that every fight is going to be a reverse execute fight from now on, but more to say there hasn't been necessarily a huge emphasis on execute damage over the last 2 tiers. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the top players will say, like, fuck you, that's just completely wrong, but, you know. But certainly, and then even Denathrius, right? So Denathrius, technically, we could say phase 1, damage didn't really matter. We had to hold damage by the end of it. Like, it wasn't really a big deal. Then the boss is at 70%, and then, you know, you have to do kind of phase 2 and kind of continually deal damage to him, and then phase 3, you have an execute phase, where I was told that unless you were in a World First Guild, it actually wasn't that hard of an execute, but anyway. But the thing with those fights is that you have a lot of other little damage checks throughout the fight that are also really important. So, like Denathrius had a lot of ads that had to die, you know, very quickly and in a very specific way. And Devastation is really good at target swapping. At least in theory, it has a lot of target swapping potential. It's not that it's super bursty. But anytime a fresh ad comes up, you're ready to go. You're already ready to deal more damage to it. So I mean that's interesting. And then the other thing is like, if quote unquote execute just means, hey, how much damage can I deal in a bloodless window at the end of the fight? If that's really all I care about, you can get there with Dragonrage. Absolutely. Dragonrage is a 26-second cooldown that gets you full mastery value. It's good. Like it's why you have this, right? And then further to anything, there's there's technology that you can kind of do to change your gameplay towards the end of a fight, to make better use of your Dragon Rage, to use your deep breath. You know, a good 3-second button that deals a ton of damage, doesn't care if you're, if you're at low health or not, just goes, right? So all of this to give kind of the other argument, because it's really easy to give the argument to just say, well, if I'm a world first guild, all I care about is execute damage, and this spec here, if this is their execute damage, that's just not going to cut it, right? You can obviously take that stance, and to me, that's the boring stance, because I think unless you're in a world first guild, that's never a good argument. That's never like a reason to bring a class or not. I honestly think that's a fair argument from the very world first guilds, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to kill the boss with no gear. They're trying to kill the boss in the most absolutely brutal way possible, with no room for error, and very often, and again, not in Shadowlands necessarily, but prior to Shadowlands, of course, execute has always been, generally speaking, on average towards the end of a raid, this sort of they put in these execute damage race moments because they think they're epic and exciting, right? And in that vein, yeah, this could be troublesome. I see a trend away from not having a damage race at the end, but I see a trend away from damage being irrelevant if it happened earlier in the fight. I see a trend away from execute being the only thing that matters. And I see a lot of potential here for both being able to target swap onto ads and doing cool stuff, and also getting good value out of out of your cooldowns, and being able to do cool stuff like changing up how you use deep breath. Maybe you don't cast it early in the fight, maybe you cast it later in the fight, that sort of thing. So anyway, so let me just see here. Let me check chat. It's not that bad, but it feels like you're losing value of secondaries that you invested in with a little more control over it. Yeah, so I think if people really get upset about it, they might see some adjustment, not necessarily immediately, but through time. This is an experiment. This whole class is an experiment in a lot of ways, right? Let's be real. I mean, a lot of this is like, hey, we're putting this in the game for the first time. We hope you like it, right? Reverse execute is a huge, huge experiment. But it's one of the things that, I mean, because, okay, you can't, and I thought about this earlier today. It's really hard to just go the other way. You can't just make a class where its mastery is execute, because then people are going to get mad. They're going to be like, wait, what? That's not fair. That mastery is so good. I want that in my class. You almost can't make a mastery that's extremely desirable, right? So what they've done instead is they've kind of given the spec a mastery that on the surface looks kind of undesirable, but they've given play around with your cooldowns, and they've made it cheap, is the thing, right? So remember, the translation factor here, for, if I say 170 rating is 1% mastery and 180 rating is 1% crit, right? Well, and I'm using the what I believe are the new numbers, by the way. These don't match my guide doc or anything, but just whatever. We'll get that updated later. Just keep that in mind. Right, so if it's 170 points for 1% of haste, 180 points for 1% of crit, to get this number here to go up, that same 180 points is going to give me 2.5% here, right? So 180 points gets me 1% crit, 180 points gets me 2.5% here. So what does that mean? Well, if I get 2.5% damage on pull and 0% damage at the end of the fight, that's an average value of 1.25%. That's already better on average than the 1% average damage I would get from one of my other secondaries. But that's not all. You also have Dragon Rage. You also have Deep Breath, right? Like, and that's kind of where these the charts I made for the document come into play, is just to show you like it it may like you might have moments where you're like, oh man, I'm not dealing as much damage right now because the enemy's on low health, boo-hoo, right? But they've made this a very attractive stat because it's cheap, and it you know it's easy to access, and it has interactions beyond just the health number. You get to play around Dragonrage, you get to play around Deep Breath, you get to swap to ads with more health, right? You have some play rounds. So that's what they've done here. They've basically said, look, we can't give this class execute the mastery because I don't know, game balance, who knows, right? Like players would get upset. But they've given you reverse execute the mastery, and then given you every reason in the world to take it, to play into their experiment. It's because it's relatively good compared to the other stats point for point. You have play around, you have some protection in your cooldowns to help make sure that you're still doing some damage at lower thresholds, right? So overall, they've done as much as they can really to make you want this without changing the whole thing. So the best thing we can kind of hope for is, hey, it turns out to be fun. If it doesn't turn out to be fun, if it turns out that the next couple raids have huge execute phases and you just can't play with an evoker because you're not making the DPS check without it or with it, then yeah, they're going to realize that they've made a huge mistake because, like, obviously you don't design a spec to be bad. Like, that's not a thing, right? So that's generally how I feel about the mastery. I think it's an experiment, but I think it clearly is set up in a way that they want you to have it, and I hope it's fun. I hope it's good. We'll see what happens, right?